This week's video discusses 5 very simple tricks that might help to improve your throwing. When you're first learning how to throw on the wheel, there are so many small things, steps, that you need to remember. And every potter also does things a little bit differently, which can make throwing as a process quite overwhelming to learn at the start. But the better you get, the more subconscious some things become, and then you can begin to shift your focus onto other things when throwing, as no longer are you going over the steps in your head. Rather, they just happen naturally, which gives you some room to try out some more advanced techniques. And the 5 tips in this video were all ones that were taught to me by potters I've trained with. And with my clay prepped, we can move over to the wheel. Now, the first one has to do with centering, but not at this beginning stage. When you're repetition throwing and making dozens upon dozens of pots, one of the balls of clay you're using may have some irregularities in it. And after the lump has been opened up, and before you pull the balls up, you may find that the thick ring of clay around the outside may have some irregularity to it. But to make that more apparent, I'll just impart some more undulations into it. If you find that this outer section is distorted after the internal base has been set, you can actually just center this outer portion again. This way, the undulations won't transfer into the walls above, and all I do is simply soak my hands and then clasp the wall with my left hand and then bring my right hand in to help compress it inward. And all I'm doing is forcing the slightly off-center clay through a very controlled gap between my hands. In theory, this means you could have a base which is off-center and walls that aren't. And I find that I use this trick rather a lot when I'm making mugs or anything en masse, as I don't have a de-airing pug mill, so inevitably some of the balls of clay I use won't be perfect. And from this point, I can continue to pull the walls up like normal. Although the next tip follows on directly from this, which is all about correcting the rim of the pot as the walls are pulled up. Again, we're going to begin with a lump of clay which I've intentionally thrown off-center. You can see that there's some unevenness in the lump of clay, and if I rest a finger on it, it jitters and bounces as the clay spins beneath it, which is a sure sign your lump of clay isn't perfectly centered. So, it's opened up, the base formed, and now, when it comes to lifting the walls up, if I can see or feel any irregularities in the wall, I'm going to compress the top of the rim downward with my index finger as I pull up. And I am exaggerating it a bit here to show you what I mean. But as the uneven wall is pulled up, I'm pressing down with my fingertip, keeping it under control and flat, as otherwise at this point the rim would be wavering rather a lot. Now, if you weren't to do this, you can of course correct any undulation by compressing it after the pull, but that isn't always so effective, and it can be very difficult to get rid of all the movement in the lip. The other option is to slice away a portion of clay from the top, but doing that removes material that you'll no longer be able to use. So I find myself using this technique rather a lot, as it means I can throw things like mugs really quickly, as I don't have to worry about centering each lump of clay perfectly. Which, let's face it, happens. When your job is making hundreds and hundreds of pots, inevitably irregularity can creep into the material, or perhaps you simply center it badly, and instead of just wiring it off and starting again, there are ways you can work around it. Although ultimately you shouldn't rely on these, as being able to center the clay and maneuver it in such a way that the walls remain lovely and even should be something you push yourself to do. Now, the next tip is one I was taught in 2013 by potter Sven Bayer during a masterclass of his I attended with one of my best potter friends. And to demonstrate this, I have to do it with the pot cut in half. But I need you to imagine that the pot is spinning throughout, as this small step is done towards the end of the throwing process, just to help thin the walls out a touch more. There's actually a small passage in my book about this technique, and a number of you have messaged me asking that I create a video to clarify what I mean, as it is a rather confusing process to describe, and it's one that a video really helps to illustrate. But essentially, what Sven showed me was a way of positioning my fingers and palm inside the pot to act like a brace to then push the clay from the outside against. The hand on the inside remains stationary, whilst the digits on the outside press the clay against it, gradually pushing the clay up against this solid shape to thin the walls just a bit more and to help remove any excess clay that's left in the bottom. My book, by the way, is a mixture of memoir, technique, stories, people, potteries, everything. And I'll leave a link down in the description below to places where it can be purchased. So imagine the pot is spinning, and this is done really towards the end of the throwing process. I place my fingers and palm inside so that they rest on the internal wall, and then with a wet knuckle or fingers from the outside I push up against it, the walls becoming just that much thinner and lighter. It's then after this that you would do the real shaping and finishing. This technique really helped me to envision the thickness of the wall towards the base, and it was during a time where I was still learning and struggling to throw larger pieces. Now in theory you can of course throw walls this thin just by pulling up alone, but sometimes a technique that's taught to you simply helps you see the process in another way. And in this case for me, it was really being able to feel the thickness of the walls towards the base as I'm throwing, rather than letting it be just some sort of mystery that I can't tell until the pot has been sliced in half. And here it is again, the fingers brace the inside and the finger on the outside pushes up against it. You don't need to travel all the way up. Sometimes it's just useful to thin out the bottom portion of the wall. You just need to be careful not to make it too thin, as if you do, and when you remove your hands, the pot could simply buckle and collapse. Now the next tip is all about water and slip and throwing, and it's one that Lisa Hammond went on about rather a lot when I started my apprenticeship with her, as initially I was a rather messy thrower who used too much water, which meant that I was constantly emptying out my wheel tray. Now, it's fine to use water when you need it, but very often you can simply scrape water and slip off the wheelhead itself to use. Often that's all you need to lubricate the next few movements. You can even scrape it off the edge of the wheel, like so. This way you catch it before it goes into the wheel tray, and ultimately it means you use less water from the container itself, and instead you're mostly just using and reusing what's on the wheel. Teaching yourself to do this is something you have to be very proactive about, especially to get into the habit of it. Although at the same time, sometimes you do need some fresh water, as I find that slip can become quite claggy and sticky, especially during the centering process when more force is put on the lump of clay. You can even scrape slip off your tools or the unused portions of your hands and place it on the inside of your palms and fingers, where it'll then transfer onto the pot, helping to hydrate the material so it flows freely through your hands. When I first started my apprenticeship with Lisa, I was very lucky to sit in between both her ex-apprentice and her current apprentice, who would soon be leaving. And for about a month I could sit and throw with both of them from either side, prodding me, telling me what I was doing wrong, what I could improve upon, that I was using too much water or using a tool in the incorrect way. And I think it was the period of my life where my skills improved the fastest, despite them both being quite harsh at times. Sometimes you need to hear that you're doing something wrong or that there's a better way of doing it before you really take heed and make those changes. Now, the final tip is one you'll have probably heard me speak about a lot. When I was in Mashiko, Japan, making pots for Ken Matsuzaki, this was something he really made a point of when I was learning to throw his Yunomi off the hump. And as the clays we used were sometimes so groggy or contained bark and pebbles, the way the forms were shaped and finished were really important, as it had to be done in such a way that imparted very little force on the walls of the pot. And if you watch my videos, this is actually a technique I talk about a lot, as I very often still see it done wrong. It's when it comes to shaping the pot, specifically when you use a wooden, metal or plastic kidney. And instead of pushing the metal into the wall, I instead hold the tool very steadily, designating the profile I want, and then I push the clay out against it. This is especially relevant on pots that are thrown thinly, as if the walls are thicker, you can get away pushing the sharp metal edge against it. But if they are thin and you ram this sharp edge against it, the metal can catch the pot, twisting and even collapsing. But by just hovering the tool on the outside and then gently pushing the clay out against it, you impart far less pressure. The process is easier, and arguably it leaves you with neater surfaces. Anyhow, that's all for this week. Short and sweet, 5 simple tips that hopefully help you throw a bit better. And just remember, this isn't a craft where you can learn everything at once, nor is there only one way to do it. I'm still learning so much, and I'm glad I am. Thanks for taking your time to watch, and I'll see you next time.